It was meant to be a night of elegance, a gathering of Britain's most powerful figures under the glittering chandeliers of the palace banquet hall. But behind the polished smiles and sparkling glasses of wine, a storm was brewing. As the royal family assembled for what should have been a unifying evening, whispers of rivalry, tension, and betrayal threatened to crack the perfect façade. What happened next would leave the monarchy and the nation reeling. The banquet was no ordinary dinner. It was a symbolic display of unity, a carefully orchestrated performance designed to reassure both the nation and the world that the monarchy stood firm. Foreign dignitaries, influential politicians, and members of high society sat shoulder to shoulder, their eyes subtly scanning every detail for signs of discord or fracture. For the palace, appearances mattered more than anything, and this evening was meant to radiate harmony. Yet beneath the surface, harmony was the last thing present. Catherine, the woman many saw as the true future of the monarchy, entered the hall with quiet dignity. She dazzled not only in appearance but in composure, though anyone who knew her well could see the weight she carried. The scrutiny was unrelenting, the pressure immense, for she was not just attending a banquet, she was being judged as a queen-in-waiting. Every gesture, every glance, every pause in conversation was analyzed, dissected, and recorded in the minds of those who would later whisper to the press. Camilla, however, entered with a different kind of confidence. She carried herself with the authority of a queen consort who had fought tooth and nail for her place at the table, literally and figuratively. And tonight, her seat was no accident. Placed deliberately near the head of the table, her position reinforced a subtle message of dominance. It was not simply about proximity to the king, it was about power. Those who noticed the arrangement also noticed William's faint expression of disapproval, a silent battle already raging before the meal even began. The exchanges between William and Camilla were subtle, but unmistakable. A cold glance here, a forced smile there, polite words laced with razor-sharp undertones. Guests who sat near enough to catch these small sparks shifted uncomfortably, sensing that the air was charged with something more dangerous than formality. They had come for a night of pageantry, but they were about to witness a drama that would redefine the monarchy's image forever. Polite chatter filled the room, but it was thin, brittle, like glass that could shatter with a single strike. Dignitaries sipped their wine and exchanged pleasantries, but all it took was a glance toward the royal family to see that beneath the smooth exterior, unease was spreading. Even those accustomed to palace intrigue could feel that the tension in the air was not ordinary, and the anticipation of something erupting grew heavier with each passing course. And yet, for all the silence and restraint, there was a foreshadowing of a dark inevitability. Everyone sensed it, though no one dared speak it. Something was about to happen. A storm was gathering, and Catherine would find herself at the very center of it, her dignity and her future on the line. But just as the evening seemed to settle into predictable formality, Camilla struck with words so sharp they shattered the room's fragile peace. It wasn't a private remark. It wasn't whispered behind Catherine's back. Camilla's words cut through the room like a blade, carrying humiliation designed not only to wound Catherine, but to remind everyone watching who still held power. At that moment, the future queen consort was reduced to tears in front of the nation's elite. The hall, once filled with polite chatter and refined laughter, froze in a stunned silence that made every second feel like an eternity. The insult itself was devastating, cloaked in sarcasm but laced with cruelty. Camilla mocked Catherine's place within the monarchy, dismissing her as a fragile ornament rather than a true partner to the future king. She framed her words as jest, but there was no mistaking the venom that dripped beneath the surface. Some women wear the crown, others only borrow it, she said with a chilling smile. In one sharp sentence, she had publicly belittled Catherine's worth and questioned her future. Gasps rippled through the hall as dignitaries and guests shifted in shock. No one expected such words. Not here, not at a night meant to showcase unity and grace. Foreign eyes widened, whispers halted, and the very air seemed to grow heavier with disbelief. The silence that followed was not peaceful but suffocating, as though the room itself recoiled from what had just been unleashed. For a moment, the grandeur of the banquet felt like a stage for cruelty rather than celebration. Catherine sat still, her composure trembling under the weight of humiliation. She fought to hold back tears, clinging to the dignity she knew she must project. Yet her pain was visible in the faint quiver of her lips and the tightening of her hands in her lap. To the world, she was the picture of restraint, but those close enough could see her struggle. She was not broken, but she was wounded deeply, publicly, and mercilessly. William's reaction was immediate and visceral. His face darkened, fury flashing in his eyes as he turned sharply toward Camilla. The prince, who had long balanced restraint with patience, suddenly looked like a man pushed to his breaking point. His jaw clenched, his chest rose with heavy breaths, and his gaze never wavered from the woman who had dared to tear his wife down in front of the world. For William, this was no longer palace politics, it was personal. The guests, caught in the crossfire, were paralyzed. Some looked away in discomfort. Others stared wide-eyed at the spectacle unraveling before them. No one dared intervene. They knew they were watching history unfold, though none could predict the full cost of what was about to happen. The balance of power inside the monarchy had shifted, and the consequences would echo far beyond that hall. And while Catherine tried to steady herself, William rose from his chair, determined to end the charade once and for all. For years, William had endured slights, whispers, and quiet attempts to overshadow Catherine. But this time, in front of the world, he refused to remain silent. The heir to the throne stood tall, his voice shaking with fury, as every eye in the banquet hall turned to witness a prince no longer willing to compromise. This was not the quiet William who so often chose diplomacy over confrontation. This was a man who had finally reached his breaking point, and nothing would hold him back. The sound of his hands slamming against the polished table cracked through the silence like thunder. Glasses rattled, silverware trembled, and the guests jolted in shock. It was a gesture rarely seen from William, who had been raised to master control. Yet at this moment, restraint was no longer an option. He turned his glare directly toward Camilla, and for the first time, the hall saw a future king openly defy the woman who had long fought to maintain her place at the heart of the monarchy. His voice, though laced with anger, carried the weight of truth. He confronted Camilla without hesitation, calling out the cruelty of her words. He reminded the entire room that Catherine was not just his wife, but the mother of his children, the woman chosen by fate to stand by his side as future queen. He declared that Catherine's dignity was not a target to be trampled by malicious remarks, not a weapon for palace games, but a crown in its own right, untouchable, sacred, and beyond reproach. The gasps that rippled through the banquet hall were louder than any applause. Guests exchanged stunned glances, realizing they were witnessing a moment that would be recorded in history books and retold for generations. What had once been hidden behind closed doors was now being laid bare under the watchful eyes of royalty, politicians, and dignitaries alike. For the first time, William was no longer just the prince. He was the defender, the protector, the man willing to challenge the very foundations of his family to shield Catherine from disgrace. At the head of the table, Charles sat frozen, his expression carved with torment. He was trapped between loyalty to his wife and duty to his son. His eyes darted from Camilla to William, his hands tightening against the table as if he could hold together a monarchy unraveling before his eyes. For a man who had waited a lifetime to wear the crown, it was a nightmare. The king was silent, powerless, while his heir tore apart the very illusion of unity Charles had fought to project. Then came the defining moment, the sentence that cut through the air with the force of a sword. William's voice hardened as he pointed across the hall, toward the grand doors that gleamed under the light. He ordered Camilla to leave. There was no room for negotiation, no softening of tone, no retreat from his words. In that instant, the hall understood that William had drawn a line that could never be erased. Camilla thought he wouldn't dare. But when William pointed toward the grand doors, the unimaginable unfolded. In a hall filled with royalty, politicians, and power brokers, the queen consort found herself stripped of authority. Camilla's footsteps echoed against marble floors as she walked out head high at first, but trembled under the weight of humiliation. For the first time, the mask of control slipped, and the world saw her vulnerability. The grandeur of the evening had been shattered, and every second of her departure became a silent indictment of her words, her power, and her place in the royal hierarchy. The moment she stepped into view, the atmosphere shifted. Crowds that had gathered erupted into cheers, their voices lifting Catherine as though she were not merely a royal figure, but a symbol of strength. What many expected to see was a woman weighed down by public shame. Yet what they saw instead was a survivor who carried herself with quiet defiance. She became, in that instant, more than the wife of a future king. She became the beating heart of a monarchy that desperately needed compassion and authenticity. Social media exploded with her image. Hashtags of support dominating the digital space as millions declared their solidarity. Posts and comments flooded the internet, painting her as the true face of the monarchy. the embodiment of resilience in the face of cruelty. Clips of her smiling while clasping William's hand spread like wildfire, becoming the visual anthem of a movement that no spin campaign could rival. The people were no longer debating who was right or wrong. Their loyalty was already choosing sides. William's role in this narrative was equally celebrated. For years, he had been seen as measured, careful, unwilling to rock the fragile balance within the royal family. But now, after standing up for Catherine, he was hailed as a protector, a husband who placed his wife's honor above the institution itself. In defending her publicly, he had not only reclaimed her dignity, but redefined his own image. The nation saw him no longer as a prince burdened by duty, but as a leader willing to sacrifice tradition for justice. Meanwhile, Camilla's reputation crumbled with astonishing speed. The polls told the story no palisade dared speak aloud. Sympathy that once shielded her evaporated overnight, replaced by frustration and disdain. The nation could forgive many things, but cruelty toward Catherine, the woman adored by millions, was unforgivable. The very strategy Camilla had employed to regain power had backfired, leaving her isolated, her public standing collapsing under the weight of her own miscalculation. The monarchy itself began to tilt. For years, its balance had been precarious, with Camilla's presence tolerated but never truly embraced. Now, the scales shifted dramatically in William and Catherine's favor. The people's choice was clear, and no amount of palace maneuvering could ignore it. Catherine's silence had spoken louder than any declaration, and William's defiance had carried the force of history. Together, they had turned a scandal into a defining moment of unity, one that left the crown itself teetering on the edge of transformation. But the battle was far from over because Charles, the king himself, would soon be forced to act. Charles had always known his reign would be difficult, but never had he imagined his crown would hang by such a fragile thread. The choice before him was unthinkable: defend his wife or risk the monarchy itself by siding with his heir. Whichever path he chose, betrayal was inevitable. For a man who had waited a lifetime to wear the crown, this was not the triumph he had once envisioned. It was a torment, a test of loyalty, and a cruel reminder that the throne demanded sacrifice not only of the heart, but of the soul. In the privacy of his chambers, Charles wrestled with the storm that consumed him. He loved Camilla, of that there was no doubt, but he could not ignore the tide of public outrage sweeping across the nation. To stand by her was to risk alienating his people, perhaps even dismantling the fragile support he had built since ascending to the throne. Yet to side with William would mean betraying the woman who had stood beside him for decades, the woman for whom he had endured scorn and controversy. His crown felt heavier with every thought, as though the weight of history pressed against his chest, daring him to make a choice he could not bear. Advisors circled like vultures, each one urging him toward stability. The monarchy must survive above all else, they insisted, reminding him that public confidence was the lifeblood of the crown. They spoke of polls, headlines, and whispers from Parliament, painting a picture of a monarchy unraveling by the hour. To them, it was simple: distance himself from Camilla, support William and Catherine, and save the institution. But to Charles, it was not simple at all. It was tearing apart the two halves of his life, forcing him to choose between love and legacy. Anne, never one to soften her words, confronted him with brutal honesty. She told him plainly that the monarchy could not withstand both scandal and silence. She warned that William's defiance had already captured the nation's heart, while Camilla's reputation was collapsing beyond repair. In her eyes, Charles's indecision was not protecting the crown, it was destroying it. Her words struck with the force of truth, leaving him shaken, yet still unable to summon the courage to decide. As the days passed, letters and conversations long buried resurfaced, exposing fractures deeper than anyone had realized. They revealed doubts, rivalries, and a monarchy more divided than the public could ever imagine. Each revelation was another crack in the façade, pushing Charles closer to a precipice from which there was no return. Meanwhile, Camilla refused to bend. She demanded loyalty, reminding Charles of the years she had endured humiliation for his sake, of the sacrifices she had made to stand at his side. Exile, she insisted, was unthinkable. To abandon her now would not only betray her, it would betray their entire shared history. And so Charles did what he had always done when faced with the impossible. He hesitated. His silence became its own answer, a void louder than any words he could have spoken. To the world, it looked like weakness. To his family, it felt like betrayal. To himself, it was the unbearable truth that no matter which way he turned, he would lose. But as Charles hesitated, the nation had already chosen, and their verdict was unmistakable. In living rooms, pubs, and workplaces across Britain, one question dominated every conversation. Who truly represented the future of the monarchy? And as public support for William and Catherine soared, Camilla's influence collapsed under the weight of humiliation. The banquet had not just been a scandal. It had rewritten the monarchy's destiny. Polls painted the picture with brutal clarity. The people had chosen William and Catherine as the rightful face of the crown. Camilla, once bolstered by her resilience, now found herself increasingly isolated. Whispers of permanent exile grew louder, her allies dwindling as her reputation collapsed. In sharp contrast, Catherine emerged as the embodiment of dignity and grace, a woman who had turned pain into strength and silence into power. William's public defense reshaped him in the eyes of the nation, not just as heir but as protector and leader, a king-in-waiting who had already begun his reign in spirit. Charles, however, stood weakened, his silence haunting him as he struggled to restore order. Yet the palace could not hide the fractures any longer. Beneath the applause for William and Catherine lay the foreshadowing of future wars, where trust within the royal family had been eroded beyond repair. And as the dust settled, one chilling truth remained: the monarchy's most dangerous battles are never fought in war rooms or battlefields. They're fought at banquet tables with words that can shatter crowns. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one. Her reaction at first was shock. Her eyes widened, her composure faltered, and the weight of William's command settled like iron on her shoulders. Yet that shock quickly hardened into something darker. She lifted her chin, refusing to show weakness, but the fury in her expression betrayed her inner turmoil. Each step she took toward the exit was a battle between pride and humiliation, and though she carried herself outwardly with defiance, the silence around her made the walk feel more like a punishment than an escape. Murmurs began to spread across the banquet hall, whispers cutting through the stillness, as if the guests could not contain their disbelief. The spectacle was unprecedented. Never before had a moment of such raw conflict played out in front of an audience, meant to witness unity and elegance. Voices dropped to hushed tones, yet the questions were the same. What had just happened? And what would happen next? The room no longer belonged to royalty. It belonged to scandal, and the walls themselves seemed to pulse with tension. At the center of it all, Catherine sat pale and visibly shaken. The sting of humiliation still clung to her, but beside her stood William, steady and unyielding. His hand rested near hers, a quiet assurance that she was no longer alone in this battle. For Catherine, the moment was both devastating and defining. She had been attacked in public, but in that same public space, she had been defended with a force that no one could ignore. The humiliation was painful, but it carried with it the seed of something greater vindication. And there sat Charles, a king divided. His silence was deafening, a haunting image that etched itself into the minds of every guest. He did not speak, did not move, did not intervene. His stillness betrayed the conflict raging within him, caught between the woman he loved and the son who embodied the future of the monarchy. That silence was not neutrality. It was paralysis, and to those watching, it revealed the deep fractures at the very heart of the crown. The guests, caught in the chaos, exchanged nervous glances, their eyes darting between the royals as though they were intruding on something forbidden. They feared the fallout, feared the headlines that would come, feared being remembered as witnesses to a moment that should never have happened. For many, the banquet had transformed from a night of prestige into a memory they wished to escape. Yet, there was no escaping the storm now unleashed. But what happened inside the palace was only the beginning. Once word of the confrontation leaked, the monarchy would never be the same. By dawn, the whispers had already reached the tabloids. William kicks Camilla out. Headlines screamed scandal, and the palace's polished image crumbled overnight. Behind gilded doors, damage control meetings spiraled into shouting matches, with advisors scrambling to contain a fire no one could extinguish. The monarchy, which had built its survival on centuries of control and silence, suddenly found itself trapped in the glare of unrelenting scrutiny. Every journalist, every commentator, every member of the public wanted answers, and the palace had none that could mend the rupture. Inside the royal household, panic spread like wildfire. Staff rushed from office to office, drafting statements that were torn apart as soon as they were written. No spin could erase the sight of Camilla walking out of the banquet hall. No carefully worded denial could undo the whispers already spreading like smoke across the nation. The press was unrelenting, demanding clarity, while the monarchy stumbled in confusion, unable to decide whether to downplay the chaos or admit to it outright. The leaks made matters worse. Guests who had been present at the banquet could not keep silent. Their words, whispered first in private, soon found their way to journalists eager to feed the frenzy. Each retelling grew sharper, more damning, painting a picture of a monarchy at war with itself. Within hours, the story was everywhere, not just in Britain but across the world. The monarchy's greatest weapon, secrecy, had been stripped away in a single night. At the heart of it all was Charles, forced into a choice he had long avoided. Would he stand by his wife, the woman whose presence had always been controversial, or would he bow to his heir, the man destined to one day carry the crown? His indecision was crippling, and his silence became its own form of betrayal. Every advisor who came to him demanded clarity, but Charles, torn between loyalty and legacy, could offer none. His hesitation only deepened the cracks, spreading through the institution he swore to protect. Yet while Charles faltered, one figure remained steady: Anne. With her characteristic bluntness, she made her loyalties clear. She quietly but firmly sided with William and Catherine, seeing in them not only the future of the monarchy, but the dignity it desperately needed to survive. Her support added weight to William's actions, showing that his stand was not a reckless outburst, but a defense of principle. In private, she warned Charles that silence would destroy him faster than choosing the wrong side. But not everyone in the palace aligned with William. Camilla's allies, furious at her public humiliation, began to plot their revenge. They whispered of ways to undermine Catherine, to paint William as impulsive, even unstable, to shift the blame and salvage Camilla's reputation. To them, this was not just a scandal, it was a battlefield, and they were not willing to lose ground without a fight. And so the monarchy's fractures, once carefully hidden, were laid bare for the world to see. The public, who had long suspected tension, now watched it unfold in real time. Trust was eroding, loyalties were questioned, and the palace no longer appeared unshakable. It looked fragile, desperate, and dangerously divided. But as advisors fought over statements and strategy, one voice refused to remain silent: Camilla herself. If William thought banishing Camilla from the banquet would silence her, he was mistaken. Within days, Camilla launched her counterattack interviews, whispered leaks, and private threats designed to claw back her power. For every insult Catherine had endured, Camilla promised retribution tenfold. Her humiliation had been public, and she would not allow that image to define her legacy. She vowed to rewrite the story, even if it meant tearing apart the very fabric of the monarchy. Retreating into the safety of her most trusted circle, Camilla plotted her response with ruthless precision. She reached out to allies, figures in the press, confidants within the palace, and loyal supporters who had always worked behind the scenes to secure her position. Each meeting, each conversation, carried the same message. This was not over. She would not allow William's fury to be the last word. She would turn her humiliation into a weapon, wielding it against those who dared to cross her. The first step was carefully orchestrated leaks, dripping into the press like poison. Headlines began to suggest that William was volatile, impulsive, and dangerously unstable. The image of the calm, steady heir was replaced with whispers of a man too emotional to lead. Anonymous sources painted him as a prince ruled by anger, incapable of separating personal grievances from duty. The damage was subtle but effective, raising questions in the public mind about whether William's outburst was an act of courage or a sign of weakness. But Camilla's campaign did not stop there. Catherine, the very woman William had fought to defend, became her next target. Stories emerged portraying her as fragile, overwhelmed by royal life, and unfit to bear the weight of future queenship. Photographs were scrutinized, speeches picked apart, and every moment of vulnerability was magnified into a flaw. The narrative was clear: Catherine was not strong, she was delicate, and the monarchy could not depend on delicacy to survive. Soon, the tabloids erupted into a war that divided the nation. Some sided with William and Catherine, praising their defiance and grace under fire. Others, influenced by Camilla's whispers, began to doubt, questioning whether the future of the crown was secure in such hands. Social media became a battlefield, every opinion louder than the last, every rumor fanning the flames of division. The monarchy was no longer a symbol of unity. It had become the center of a national argument. Caught in the middle was Charles, battered on all sides. His reputation, already fragile, was bruised further as critics accused him of weakness, of failing to act, of watching as his family tore itself apart. He was king in name, but in practice, he seemed powerless to stop the unraveling chaos. To the public, his silence looked less like caution and more like complicity, and each day he remained quiet. His crown grew heavier and less secure. Yet as Camilla tightened her grip on this campaign of vengeance, she failed to anticipate one thing. For all the whispers, leaks, and threats, she was preparing the stage for a twist she could not control. Because while she gathered strength, Catherine was preparing a move that no one expected that would shift the entire battle. Catherine didn't need to shout, nor did she need to retaliate in kind. Her power lay in her silence, her grace, and her ability to capture hearts without uttering a single word. When she appeared in public days later smiling, composed, hand in hand with William, the nation rallied behind her with overwhelming force. The image was powerful, not because of grandeur or theatrics, but because it spoke of resilience. She had been humiliated in front of the world, yet here she stood, unbroken, her dignity intact, and her silence deafening to those who sought to destroy her.